AOC MOCKED, his law degree. 47 seconds later, Kennedy crushed her with one sentence. The room buzzed with anticipation, the kind that hangs thick in the air when a public hearing is about to take a sharp turn. Rows of polished wooden benches were filled with aides reporters and onlookers, their eyes darting between the raised dais where the senators sat and the witness table below. The chamber, with its high ceilings and heavy drapes, seemed to amplify every sound: a cough, a shuffle of papers, a whispered aside. At the center of it all, Thupper Senator John Neely Kennedy sat, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, like a man who'd seen storms brewing before and knew how to weather them. His suit was crisp, his tie a muted shade of blue, and his expression carried the calm assurance of someone who'd spent decades navigating courtrooms and Senate halls alike. Across the room, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, known to the world as AOC, leaned forward. Her hands clasped tightly around a pen, her face a mix of determination and barely concealed disdain. The tension between them was palpable, a silent prelude to a clash that no one in the room could have predicted, but everyone could feel coming. It began with a question, one of those pointed inquiries designed to draw blood rather than answers. AOC's voice cut through the chamber, sharp and deliberate, as she addressed Kennedy directly. "Senator," she said, her tone laced with a practiced edge, "I find it curious that someone with your, let's call it an outdated law degree, thinks they can lecture us on modern policy." The words landed like a jab, and a murmur rippled through the crowd. She paused, letting the implication hang, her eyes as locked on Kennedy as if daring him to flinch. "I mean, no offense," she continued, though her smirk suggested otherwise, "but a degree from a bygone era doesn't exactly scream expertise in today's world, does it?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching like insects against paper. A few aides exchanged glances, sensing the gauntlet had been thrown. AOC leaned back, satisfied her expression, one of someone who believed they'd landed a decisive blow. She'd framed Kennedy as a relic, a man out of touch, his credentials dusty and irrelevant in the fast-paced progressive world she championed. But Kennedy didn't move. Not a muscle. His face remained steady, almost serene, as if he'd heard this kind of jab 1,000 times before and had learned long ago not to take the bait. His hands rested lightly on the table in front of him, fingers interlaced, and his gaze stayed fixed on AOC, not with anger, but with something else, something calculating, like a chess player studying the board before making a move. The silence stretched, and what had seemed like a moment of triumph for AOC began to feel uneasy. The crowd waited, expecting a quick retort, a flash of indignation, or at least a flicker of discomfort. But Kennedy gave them nothing. His calm was unnerving, a quiet force that seemed to suck the air out of AOC's attack. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words, and then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. Not a smirk, but a hint of amusement, like a man who knew something his opponent didn't. The chamber was no stranger to verbal sparring. These hearings were often theaters of ego, where senators postured for cameras and sound bites, each trying to outmaneuver the other for a viral moment. But this felt different. AOC's attack wasn't just a policy disagreement. It was personal, a direct challenge to Kennedy's legitimacy, his education, his very presence in the room. She'd chosen her words carefully, painting him as a man whose time had passed, whose law degree from decades ago couldn't possibly hold up in a world of new ideas and bold reforms. It was a tactic designed to diminish, to rally her supporters by casting Kennedy as an out-of-touch figure clinging to outdated credentials. And for a moment, it seemed to work. The younger aides in the room nodded subtly, and a few reporters tapped out tweets already framing the exchange as AOC's latest takedown. The narrative was taking shape, the young dynamic congresswoman schooling the old guard. Yet Kennedy's silence was rewriting that narrative second by second. He didn't rise to the bait, didn't lash out, didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes still locked on AOC, and reached for a leather folder on the table. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. The folder was worn, but elegant, the kind of thing a seasoned lawyer might carry, its edges softened by years of use. He opened it slowly, revealing a stack of papers neatly organized inside. The room watched, curious, as he sifted through them, his fingers moving with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times in courtrooms long before he ever stepped into the Senate. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge AOC's taunt, but every action radiated confidence, quiet assurance that he was in control. AOC, sensing the shift, pressed harder. "I'm just saying, Senator, the world has moved on. We need fresh perspectives, not folks resting on laurels from a degree earned when typewriters were still a thing." The jab drew a few chuckles from the audience, but they were nervous, tentative, as if the room could sense the tide turning. Kennedy's silence was no longer just a pause. It was a statement. He pulled a single sheet of paper from the folder and held it up, not waving it dramatically, but simply letting it be seen. The paper was crisp, official, bearing the seal of a federal court. He didn't read from it, didn't need to. Its presence was enough to shift the room's attention. AOC's smirk faltered just for a moment, as she realized she might have underestimated her opponent. Kennedy finally spoke, his voice low and steady, with that Louisiana drawl that carried both warmth and steel. "Congresswoman," he began, pausing just long enough to ensure every ear was tuned to him, "I don't think it's my degree that's the issue here." The words were simple, unadorned, but they cut through the room like a blade. He didn't raise his voice, didn't gesture wildly, but the weight of his presence filled the chamber. The reporters stopped writing, the aides stopped whispering, and even AOC seemed to freeze her pen, hovering over her notes. Kennedy's eyes never left her, and in that moment, it was clear he wasn't just responding to her attack. He was setting the stage for something bigger. The crowd leaned in, sensing the shift. Kennedy's calm was not the retreat of a man cornered. It was the poise of someone who'd faced worse and come out stronger. He placed the paper back in the folder, closing it with a soft snap that echoed in the now silent room. "I've found," he continued, his voice still measured, "that it's not the age of a degree that matters, but what you do with it." The line wasn't loud, wasn't flashy, but it landed with the force of a gavel. A few onlookers nodded, and a murmur of agreement rippled through the older members of the audience, those who'd seen enough of life to know that experience often trumps bravado. AOC opened her mouth to respond, but Kennedy wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair, his posture still relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, like a lawyer about to deliver a closing argument. "You see," he said, "I've spent my life working for folks who don't care much about what's written on a diploma. They care about what's done in their name." It was a subtle pivot, turning the conversation from personal attacks to a broader point about service and results. The room felt it, the shift from AOC's flashy provocation to Kennedy's grounded authority. He wasn't playing her game, he was rewriting the rules. The hearing continued, but the energy had changed. AOC's initial confidence seemed to waver, her notes now a shield rather than a weapon. Kennedy, meanwhile, sat, as he had from the start, calm and composed, his folder resting on the table like a quiet promise of more to come. The reporters were no longer typing out AOC's soundbite. They were watching Kennedy, waiting for his next move. The aides, too, were captivated, some scribbling notes, others whispering about the paper he'd held up. What was it? A letter A. Case record. Whatever it was, it had shifted the room's gravity, pulling all eyes toward the senator from Louisiana. As the session moved on to other matters, the moment lingered. AOC tried to regain her footing, firing off questions about policy details, but her earlier attack had lost its sting. Kennedy answered each question with the same measured tone, his responses clear and precise, grounded in a deep understanding of the law and its practical impacts. He didn't need to boast or grandstand. His presence did that for him. The crowd began to see it not just a senator, but a man who'd earned his place through years of hard work, who'd faced doubters before, and would face them again always with the same quiet strength. The confrontation wasn't over, not by a long shot. AOC was too sharp, too determined to let the moment pass without a fight. But Kennedy had set the tone, and the room knew it. He'd taken her challenge, absorbed it, and turned it into an opportunity to show who he was, not through bluster, but through the kind of steady resolve that only comes from a life spent proving oneself. The paper in his folder, the calm in his voice, the glint in his eye, all of it signaled that this was only the beginning. Whatever came next, Kennedy was ready, and the world was watching. The hearing room still buzzed with the aftershock of the opening clash, the air heavy with unspoken questions about what would come next. The polished mahogany table before Senator John Neely Kennedy gleamed under the chamber's lights, reflecting the faint outline of his leather folder, which now seemed to hold the room's attention as much as he did. Kennedy sat with the same unruffled calm, his hands resting lightly on the folder, his eyes steady but warm, like a man who'd long ago learned to trust his instincts in a fight. Across the dais, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC as the headlines called her, gripped her pen a little tighter, her posture betraying a flicker of unease. She'd landed her blow, mocking Kennedy's law degree as a relic of a bygone era, but his measured response, or lack thereof, had thrown her off balance. The crowd sensed it too, their murmurs softening as they leaned forward, eyes darting between the two figures, waiting for the next move in this high-stakes duel. Kennedy's silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. He'd spent decades in courtrooms facing opponents who thought they could outtalk or outmaneuver him, only to find themselves undone by his preparation and patience. Now, in this Senate chamber, he was playing the same game, but the stakes were higher, the audience larger. He opened his folder again, the soft creak of leather cutting through the room's tension like a signal. From it, he pulled a single sheet of paper, its edges crisp, bearing the embossed seal of a federal court. He didn't wave it or brandish it for effect. He simply placed it on the table, letting its presence speak for itself. The room's focus sharpened reporters pausing their typing aids, craning their necks to catch a glimpse. AOC's eyes flicked to the document, her confidence wavering for a split second before she masked it with a tight smile. Congresswoman Kennedy began his Louisiana drawl, slow and deliberate, each word chosen with the precision of a seasoned lawyer. You mentioned my degree earlier. I reckon you think it's not much to look at. But let me tell you about a case from a few years back. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. He glanced at the paper, not because he needed to read it, but to draw every eye to it. Here's a letter from Judge Margaret Ellison, Fifth Circuit. She wrote it after a case I argued, one of those messy ones where the law's not just words on a page, but a lifeline for folks who've got nothing else. He paused, letting the words settle, his gaze steady on AOC. She didn't care much about when I got my degree. She cared about how I used it. The letter, as Kennedy described it, wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a testament to his work. He didn't boast or delve into self-praise, but his words painted a vivid picture. The case had been a thorny one, involving a small business owner tangled in a web of regulations that threatened to bankrupt him. Kennedy, then a practicing attorney, had spent months poring over legal texts, interviewing witnesses, and building a case that turned on a single obscure precedent buried in decades-old case law. His argument in court had been meticulous, weaving together logic and empathy, convincing the judge not just of the law's letter, but of its spirit. Judge Ellison's letter praised his clarity, his command of the law, and his ability to make complex issues accessible without losing their depth. It was the kind of endorsement that carried weight not because of who signed it, but because it reflected a career built on diligence and results. AOC shifted in her seat, her pen tapping lightly against her notes. She wasn't one to back down, and the crowd could see her mind working, searching for a way to regain the upper hand. "That's a nice story, Senator," she said, her voice sharp but measured. "But one case doesn't make you an expert on the issues we're facing today. The world's changed. We need people who understand the now, not the then." It was a calculated pivot, an attempt to redirect the conversation back to her narrative of progress versus obsolescence. The younger members of the audience nodded, and a few reporters jotted down her words, sensing a soundbite. But Kennedy didn't take the bait. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers, not with hostility, but with the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced tougher opponents and come out on top. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice still steady, "I don't claim to know everything about today's world. But I know this. The folks I work for, farmers, small business owners, teachers, they don't care about what's trendy. They care about what's true. And truth doesn't expire with a degree." The line landed softly but firmly like a stone, dropped into still water, sending ripples through the room. A few onlookers exchanged glances, and a murmur of agreement passed through the older members of the crowd. Kennedy wasn't just defending himself, he was speaking to a broader truth, one that resonated with anyone who'd ever been underestimated because of where they came from or when they learned their craft. He went on, his voice never rising, but growing richer, more compelling. "That case I mentioned, it wasn't about me. It was about a man who'd put everything he had into his business only to see it nearly taken away by rules he didn't write. I spent nights digging through law books not because I wanted to prove I was smart, but because I knew what was at stake for him." He paused, letting the human element of the story sink in. I didn't need a new degree to understand his struggle. I needed to listen to learn to fight for what was right. "That's what I've done my whole life, and I'm not about to stop now." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. Even AOC seemed momentarily at a loss, her pen still, her eyes fixed on the table. Kennedy's story wasn't just about one case. It was about a lifetime of preparation, of showing up when it mattered most. He didn't need to list his credentials or recount every victory. The letter from Judge Ellison was enough to prove his point. It was a reminder that his work wasn't built on flash or fame, but on the steady, unglamorous labor of getting things done. The crowd felt it, their attention shifting from AOC's earlier bravado to Kennedy's grounded resolve. Reporters who'd been ready to crown AOC the victor now scribbled notes about Kennedy's response, sensing a shift in the narrative. Aides whispered among themselves, some pulling out their phones to search for the case he'd mentioned, curious about the man who'd turned a single letter into a moment of authority. AOC tried to pivot again, her voice sharper, now tinged with frustration. "Senator, I respect your experience, but we're talking about systemic issues here, not just one person's story. We need bold ideas, not old cases." It was a fair point, but it lacked the sting of her earlier attacks. Kennedy's calm had disarmed her, his story grounding the debate in something real, something human. He didn't respond immediately, instead, taking a slow sip of water, his movements deliberate, giving the room time to absorb his words. When he spoke again, it was with the same measured tone. "I hear you, Congresswoman, but systems are made of people, and people deserve someone who'll fight for them, not just talk about it." The line was simple, but it cut deep, reframing the debate on his terms. The hearing moved on, but the moment lingered. Kennedy's folder remained on the table, a silent promise of more to come. AOC's notes were now a flurry of scribbles, her earlier confidence tempered by the realization that she'd underestimated her opponent. The crowd, too, was captivated, their attention fixed on Kennedy, not just for what he'd said, but for how he'd said it, with a quiet strength that didn't need volume to command respect. He'd turned AOC's attack into an opportunity not by shouting her down, but by showing up prepared, armed with the truth of his work. The stage was set for what would come next, and everyone in the room knew Kennedy wasn't just playing defense, he was building towards something bigger. The Senate chamber hummed with a restless energy, the kind that builds when a confrontation teeters on the edge of something unforgettable. The polished wooden dais, the rows of attentive faces, the faint scratch of reporters' pens, all of it seemed to pulse with the aftermath of Senator John Neely Kennedy's measured response to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's sharp attack. AOC had come out swinging, mocking Kennedy's law degree as a dusty relic, a jab meant to paint him as out of touch in a world that demanded fresh ideas. But Kennedy, with his calm Louisiana drawl and a single letter from a respected judge, had already begun to shift the narrative. His leather folder, now a quiet symbol of his preparation, sat on the table, like a loaded weapon, its contents hinting at more to come. The crowd reporters, aides, and onlookers leaned forward, their eyes darting between Kennedy's unflappable presence and AOC's barely concealed frustration. The stage was set for a moment that would not only turn the tables, but leave an indelible mark on everyone watching. AOC, sensing the need to regain control, straightened in her seat, her hands gripping her notes as if anchoring herself against the tide. "Senator," she said, her voice cutting through the chamber's hum, "you keep talking about your past, your cases, your old-school approach. But we're in a new era. The challenges we face, climate inequality, technology, they need bold, forward-thinking solutions, not stories from decades ago." Her words were sharp, designed to reframe the debate on her terms, to cast Kennedy as a man tethered to a bygone time. A few younger aides nodded, their phones buzzing with drafts of tweets ready to amplify her point. Reporters jotted down her words, sensing a soundbite that could dominate the news cycle. For a moment, it seemed AOC might reclaim the momentum, her passion and clarity a reminder of why she'd become a force in Congress. But Kennedy didn't budge. His posture remained relaxed, his hands resting lightly on the table, his eyes fixed on AOC with a gaze that was neither hostile nor defensive, just steady, like a man who'd faced tougher storms and knew exactly how to navigate this one. The room felt the weight of his silence, a pause that wasn't hesitation, but strategy, the kind honed over years in courtrooms where timing could make or break a case. He tilted his head slightly, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips, not a smirk, but a quiet acknowledgement that he was ready for what came next. "Congresswoman," he said at last, his voice low and deliberate, each word carrying the warmth of his Louisiana roots and the precision of a seasoned lawyer. "I reckon you're right about the world changing. But one thing that doesn't change is the need for folks to mean what they say and say what they mean." The line landed with a quiet force, and the room seemed to hold its breath. AOC's eyes narrowed slightly, her pen pausing over her notes as she sensed a shift. Kennedy's words weren't just a response. They were a prelude, a signal that he was about to change the game. He nodded to an aide, who stepped forward with a small tablet, its screen glinting under the chamber's lights. Kennedy took it with the same unhurried calm that had defined his presence all day, his fingers moving with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "You see," he continued, his voice steady, but now tinged with a hint of anticipation. "I was at an event a while back, and I heard something that stuck with me. I think it's worth sharing with the folks here today." He tapped the tablet, and a large screen behind the dais flickered to life, casting a soft glow across the room. The crowd leaned in, their curiosity piqued as the faint hum of a video loading filled the chamber. The footage began, the sound crackling slightly, but clear enough to recognize the setting, a bustling fundraiser packed with donors and supporters, the kind of event where every word is weighed for its impact. AOC's voice came through the speakers, confident and vibrant, addressing the crowd with her trademark energy. "I've worked with people who've fought their way up," she said on the recording, her words ringing with conviction. "Folks who went to night school, who earned their degrees through sweat and sacrifice, they're the ones who bring real perspective, who outwork anyone from a fancy university." The crowd in the video erupted in applause, and AOC's face lit up with a smile, her passion undeniable. The screen froze on that moment, her expression a mix of pride and sincerity, and Kennedy let the silence stretch, letting the weight of her words settle over the room like a storm cloud. A gasp rippled through the chamber, soft at first, but growing as the realization hit. Reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances, their fingers hovering over keyboards already drafting posts about the bombshell. Aides whispered to each other, some pulling out their phones to record the moment, sensing it would dominate the news cycle. AOC's face tightened, her earlier confidence giving way to a flicker of unease, her pen now still in her hand. Kennedy didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it linger, let the crowd process what they'd just heard. Then, with a voice as calm as ever, he spoke. "Now, Congresswoman," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "That sounds an awful lot like the kind of story you were praising, doesn't it? Folks who work hard, who earn their place through grit and determination. Folks like me with a law degree earned the hard way, not handed to me on a silver platter." The room erupted in murmurs, the sound swelling as the crowd processed the irony. Kennedy's move was surgical, exposing the contradiction in AOC's attack with a precision that left no room for retreat. She'd mocked his degree as outdated, yet here she was on video celebrating the very kind of journey he'd taken, a journey of hard work, late nights, and relentless effort. The hypocrisy was laid bare, and the crowd felt it, their attention now fully on Kennedy, who sat back with the ease of a man who knew he'd landed his point. Reporters were already typing furiously, framing the moment as a masterclass in debate. Kennedy turns AOC's words against her. One headline would read, "Social media was lighting up, with users sharing clips of the video praising Kennedy's quick thinking and quiet strength. Never mess with a lawyer who knows your playbook." One tweet read, racking up thousands of likes in minutes. AOC tried to recover her voice, sharp but less certain now. "Senator, you're twisting my words," she said, her hands gesturing as if to push back the narrative. "I was talking about people who bring fresh ideas, who adapt to today's challenges, not just lean on old credentials." It was a valiant effort, but the room could sense the shift. Her earlier attacks had relied on flash and momentum, but Kennedy's response was rooted in something deeper: truth, consistency, and a quiet authority that didn't need volume to command respect. He didn't interrupt her, didn't cut her off. He waited, letting her words fade into the hum of the chamber before responding. "Congresswoman," he said, his tone almost gentle, "I'm not twisting anything. I'm just holding up a mirror. You said it yourself. Hard work matters. So let's talk about the work, not the noise. The line was a thunderclap, not because it was loud, but because it was undeniable. The crowd murmured again, some nodding in agreement, others whispering about the senator's ability to turn a personal attack into a broader point about integrity. AOC's notes were now a flurry of scribbles, her earlier poise replaced by a visible effort to regroup. She fired off a question about policy, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But the room's energy had shifted. Kennedy answered with his usual clarity, his responses grounded in a deep understanding of the law and its real-world impact. But it was clear the moment belonged to him. The video, the letter, his calm delivery, they'd all worked together to flip the narrative, casting him not as a relic, but as a figure of substance, someone who'd earned his place through action, not rhetoric. The aftermath was immediate. Social media exploded with clips of the fundraiser video hashtags trending about Kennedy's brilliance and AOC's misstep. Kennedy just played chess while AOC played checkers. One user wrote the post shared thousands of times. Another called it the moment a senator showed what real leadership looks like. Reporters were drafting stories, framing the exchange as a turning point, a moment where Kennedy's understated approach had outshone AOC's fire. Aides whispered about his reputation for being prepared, for always having a card to play, and now they'd seen it in action. The chamber continued its business, but the energy had changed. Kennedy sat as he had from the start, calm, composed, and in control, while AOC, though still formidable, seemed to carry the weight of her own words. The tables had been turned, and the world was watching, waiting for Kennedy's next move. The Senate chamber had transformed into a stage where every gesture, every word carried the weight of a larger truth. The clash between Senator John Neely Kennedy and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had reached its crescendo, leaving the room in a state of charged silence. The crowd, reporters, aides, and onlookers sat riveted, their attention fixed on Kennedy, whose calm presence had turned AOC's fiery attack into a moment of profound clarity. His leather folder, now closed, rested on the table like a silent witness to his preparation, while the screen behind him, still dark from the video he'd played, lingered in the minds of everyone present. AOC's earlier taunts about his outdated law degree had been deftly countered, first with a judge's letter, then with her own words from a fundraiser exposing her contradiction. The air was thick with anticipation, not just for the next exchange, but for the deeper lesson. Kennedy was about to impart a lesson that would resonate far beyond the chamber's walls. Kennedy leaned forward, his hands clasped loosely, his eyes scanning the room with a warmth that belied the steel beneath. The murmurs had died down, and even AOC, her notes, now a tangled mess of scribbles, seemed to sense that the senator was building toward something bigger. He adjusted his glasses, a small, deliberate motion that drew every eye, and when he spoke, his Louisiana drawl was as steady as ever, each word chosen with the care of a man who'd spent a lifetime weighing the impact of his voice. "Congresswoman," he began, addressing AOC directly, but speaking to the entire room. "We've talked a lot today about degrees, about who's qualified and who's not. But let me tell you something I've learned over the years. It's not the paper on your wall that defines you. It's the work you do, the people you serve, and the truth you hold to when the room gets hot." The words landed softly, but carried a force that silenced the chamber. Reporters paused, their typing their pens, hovering over notepads, sensing a moment that would make headlines. Aides who'd been whispering about the video Kennedy had played now leaned forward, their phones forgotten. AOC's expression was unreadable, her earlier confidence replaced by a cautious stillness. Kennedy didn't gloat or press his advantage. Instead, he shifted the conversation to something universal, something that spoke to everyone in the room regardless of their politics or background. I've met folks all over this country, he continued, farmers who've lost crops to bad policy, small business owners fighting to keep their doors open, parents working 2 jobs to give their kids a shot. They don't ask me where I got my degree. They ask me if I'll listen, if I'll fight for them. And that's what I've done every single day. His voice was steady, but there was a passion beneath it, a conviction that resonated with the crowd. He wasn't just defending himself. He was speaking for anyone who'd ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told they didn't belong. The room felt it, the aides who'd clawed their way into these halls, the reporters who'd started at small-town papers, the onlookers who'd faced their own battles to be heard. Kennedy's words were a reminder that worth isn't measured by titles or pedigrees, but by the impact you make. He paused, letting the silence amplify his point, his eyes moving across the room as if inviting everyone to see themselves in his story. AOC tried to interject, her voice sharper now, tinged with a defensive edge. "Senator, no one's saying you haven't worked hard. But we're talking about systemic change, about big ideas that move us forward. That's what people need now." It was a fair point, one that might have landed with force earlier in the hearing, but Kennedy's presence had shifted the room's gravity. His calm, his preparation, his ability to turn her own words against her had made her argument feel hollow, like a slogan searching for substance. He didn't interrupt her, didn't cut her off. He waited, letting her words fade into the silence before responding. "Congresswoman," he said, his tone gentle but firm, "big ideas are only as good as the folks they help. And helping folks starts with listening, with showing up, with doing the work, even when no one's watching." The crowd was captivated, their earlier focus on AOC's flash now replaced by Kennedy's substance. He didn't need to raise his voice or resort to theatrics. His story did that for him. He leaned back slightly, his hands still resting on the table, and continued. "When I was a young lawyer, I took on cases no one else wanted, folks who couldn't pay much, folks who'd been written off. I didn't do it for applause or headlines. I did it because it was right. And every time someone tried to tell me I wasn't good enough, I let my work answer for me." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that filled the room, a reminder that Kennedy's career wasn't built on privilege or posturing, but on a relentless commitment to doing what was right. He turned his gaze to the crowd, his voice softening but no less powerful. "That's what I want folks to take away from this. It's not about where you studied or what's written on your diploma. It's about what you do with what you've got. It's about showing up day after day and fighting for what's true." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the audience like a call to action. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing they'd just heard the kind of quote that would echo across op-eds and social media. Aides nodded, some visibly moved, as if Kennedy's words had spoken directly to their own struggles. Even AOC, though, still poised, seemed to sense the shift, her earlier attacks now a distant memory. Kennedy wasn't done. He reached for his folder one last time, not to pull out another document, but to place his hand on it, a gesture that anchored his words. "I don't need anyone to tell me my worth," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I don't need a fancy title or a degree from a big-name school. What I need, what we all need, is to believe in justice, in doing right by the people we serve. That's what keeps me going, and that's what I'll keep doing, no matter who tries to tear me down." The line was a thunderclap, not because it was loud, but because it was true. The crowd erupted in murmurs, some clapping softly, others whispering about the senator who'd just turned a personal attack into a universal truth. The hearing moved on, but the moment lingered. Social media was already alight with clips of Kennedy's speech, his words trending alongside hashtags about integrity and resilience. Kennedy just schooled AOC without raising his voice. One tweet read, shared thousands of times. Another called him the quiet giant of the Senate, a nod to his ability to command a room with nothing but his presence and his principles. Reporters were drafting stories framing the exchange as a masterclass in turning the tables not through anger or ego, but through preparation, truth, and a deep commitment to service. The lesson was clear, and it was one that went beyond the chamber, beyond the clash with AOC. Kennedy's story was a reminder that real strength doesn't come from shouting the loudest or striking the hardest. It comes from showing up, from doing the work, from holding fast to what's right, even when the world tries to tell you otherwise. For the young aides in the room, it was a call to keep pushing no matter the obstacles. For the reporters, it was a story of substance over flash. For the onlookers, it was a moment that made them question their own assumptions about who belongs and why. As the session drew to a close, Kennedy sat back, his folder untouched. Now his work done. AOC continued with her questions, her passion undimmed, but her momentum blunted. The crowd watched her, but their eyes kept drifting back to Kennedy, to the man who'd taken a moment of doubt and turned it into a lesson for the ages. The lesson wasn't just about winning a debate. It was about living with integrity, about proving your worth through actions, not words. It was a lesson for everyone in the room, and for the millions watching online, a reminder that true leadership doesn't need a podium. It needs only the courage to stand firm and the wisdom to let your work speak for itself.